go.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Great to see you all here at Utopie, The Hague. So for this panel discussion on just transitions. So this is one of the many events that we've had as part of the legal program this week and also here at Utopie. So thanks Utopie for letting us use this room for this event and many other events. Yes, deserves an applause. So yeah, before I do a proper introduction, I also want to thank all the people that made this possible, especially Daniel and Isha. They have been organizing everything, invited our great panelists, which who I will present in a minute. And also, there's lots of people here collaborating with us. We have Susa, we have Sophie, we have Roland, we have Naomi, all here present, so thanks a lot for doing this. Okay, so maybe just it's good to mention that this event is also being live streamed, so even if we're not that many, and I hope still people might come in a bit late, also people online can watch this. My name is Sonja Bleker. I'm part of Extinction Rebellion, part of the Inclusion and Power group, and I'll be moderating this event. We have a very nice program. We will start with a panel discussion, about 50 minutes. After that we will have a short break. And after the break we will have Nancy Fraser online, and I will also introduce her. She will be visible on the screen. Okay, so Daniel, he gave me a really nice introduction, which I will now give you, and after that I will introduce the three of you. So, yes, just transitions. Well, Sophie? No?
Is er iemand die een Nederlandse vertaling zou willen hebben?
Sorry, I forgot. Is there the need for translation, vertaling van Engels naar Nederlands?
Nee? Oké, top.
Okay, great. The crises we are currently facing are multidimensional and wicked, and they cannot be solved by linear solutions generated by outdated ways of thinking. They affect all sectors of society and all aspects of life. And to address this climate emergency, decarbonization must go hand in hand with decolonization and democratization. In short, the only way out of this climate emergency is a just one. And that's also why Extinction Rebellion made climate justice the core of this Climate Rebellion Week. Among the core questions we are faced with are production and employment. Moving towards sustainability means that we shift towards greener productions and away from dirty and polluting industries and our reliance on fossil fuels. Yet such transitions are heavily disruptive, especially for the people employed in those sectors, in those industries. Any transition that is just must make sure that this change does not come only at the expenses of workers employed in those industries or the communities that depend on those incomes. So just transitions, while it has its origins in the labor and environmental justice movements in North America, at around the 1980s they were upcoming. And those movements were fighting for a right to retrain, protection against negative consequences and compensations if jobs were affected by changes, such as, for example, stricter environmental regulations. And even more than constructing such safety nets, calls for a just transition seek to challenge existing power relations and inequalities, and offer ways for people in affected industries to embrace rather than resist to change. And since the 1990s, and together with the need of a revolutionary change to the global economy to avoid climate change and socio-economic devastation, calls for a just transition are going global. And in 2015, it was even included in the preface of the Paris Agreement. And since then, its use has multiplied. Apart from trade unions, many progressive political actors, ranging from NGOs to grassroots movements, to academics mobilized under the banner of just transitions, demanding radical, just and transformational change for the working class and communities around the world. But at the same time, supra and intergovernmental organizations such as the European Commission or the International Labour Organization have also picked it up, as well as companies and networks of companies. However, for these actors, just transitions have become intertwined with like a green growth agenda that seek to introduce a new form of like managed capitalism, where governments and green businesses still sit at the helm of decision making. So, well, against this background, then what do we actually mean when demanding a just transition? Where do we currently stand with it? And what are the forces opposing to just transitions? What is the role of different actors in bringing it forward? So, well, in this panel discussion, we aim to shine some light on these questions and even more. And well, for that, I want to welcome our three panelists. So, thanks a lot for being here today. So, Katie Sandwell, yeah, she joined the Transnational Institute, which is an international research and advocacy institute based in Amsterdam. She joined that in 2016 after working with Canadian food sovereignty, anti-poverty and local food movements. She holds a master's degree in environmental studies from York University in Canada, and she works with the Transnational Institute's Agrarian and Environmental Justice team, where her work deals with questions of just transition, human rights, corporate concentration, food sovereignty and oceans. An applause. Okay, then in the middle we have Niels Jongerius. He joined the Economic Justice, Corporate Power and Alternatives program of the Transnational Institute in February 2016. He has a BA degree in International Relations from the University of Groningen, and he worked in the European Parliament from 2009 till 2014. And in 2015 he worked at the German Trade Union Federation in Berlin, Germany. He also studied and worked in Shanghai. And in 2021 he got voted in the FNV Trade Union Parliament, representing amongst others workers in the non-profit sector. And then, last but not least, we have Marisol Rijntje. Well, she's a political organizer and researcher. I forgot to give you a big applause. Sorry for that. And then Marisol Rijntje, well, she's a political organizer and researcher based in the Netherlands, and currently she is working on the Shell Must Fall campaign, as well as the Future Beyond Shell podcast. Both projects aspire to contribute to a just transition by mapping out strategic pathways to the dismantling of the Dutch-British oil and gas major and to promote systematic change. Thank you, and an applause for Marisol. So, yeah, well, it's great to have you here. So, well, I'll be asking some questions, so let's see how we go in time. And after the round of questions we have prepared, there's also room for interaction with the public, so you get the chance to well, ask your questions as well. So, yeah, well, I will start with like the most basic question. So maybe like from your work and your own perspective, you could explain a bit like what is then exactly a just transition, and also where do we currently stand with a just transition? Who volunteers to go first? Yeah?
Hello? Yes. Yeah, well, thanks everyone. Really nice to see everyone here, especially at the end of what I know has been a long and for many of you tiring week, so thanks for joining us for this discussion. Yeah, what is just transition? I think you've given a brilliant introduction to the question. I want to kind of emphasize a few points about that were already raised, but The first one that I think is kind of important to say is that just transition is, as you say, a contested concept. So it's a concept over which we are struggling, and different actors are struggling to use it in different ways. So it's being inserted into these international documents, but what it will do there and how we can use it there is still unclear and is still a matter for struggle, basically. So I would say when we talk about what does just transition mean, we're not just trying to define it as a term in some abstract way and figure out what it means. Rather, we're trying to push for a certain vision of the future of climate action. And we're trying to push for that vision using this term and using that as a kind of a hook to bring institutions and to bring governments and to bring other powerful actors with us into this vision of a much more comprehensive kind of change. So about what that vision is for a just transition, I think you've given a great start to it. It's something that we as TNI have spent quite some time trying to elaborate, and if you want, there is a little booklet at the back there which shares the results of some of our discussions with unions and with environmental justice organizations on working out some of the core principles of just transition. I won't go through all of them here because I'm supposed to do this in 4 minutes. But I want to touch on just 2 quite important points about it. So the one already touched on a little bit, but that is a just transition is one that sees social and environmental justice fundamentally as 2 sides of the same coin. In the words of Eduardo Galeano, it sees the rights of people and the rights of nature as 2 names for the same dignity. So we don't see justice as something which can be tacked on to climate action after the fact, or as a matter of double checking. Rather, we see that the climate crisis, the social crises of our times, the economic crises, are all different products of the same racist, sexist, imperialist system. And that in order to tackle the climate crisis, we need to tackle that system and the root causes of the crises we're facing. So just transition tells us that we will not be able to manage the scale and scope of change we need to address the climate crisis without fundamentally changing the way that power is distributed in our society. Fundamentally, it sees the climate crisis as a crisis of the capitalist system and one that we will not solve without transforming that system. Secondly, relatedly, just transition also recognizes and gives the kind of central agency to the people who are embedded in, who are exploited by, and who are dependent on the present system, and sees that those are the people who have the power to change it. That's why I think it's important and useful to have Neil speaking here from the perspective of the unions. But in line with the thinking of people like Nancy Fraser, who will speak later, as well as Isa Shivji, a great Ethiopian economist, I really want to push for a much broader understanding also of who those working people involved in the system are. So it's not only people working in fossil industries, and not only people working in the most toxic industries who will be impacted by this change and who have the power to drive this change. Instead, I really see that it's everyone who needs to work to survive, everyone who works for their living, whether they do that in fossil fuel and extractive industries, in hospitals, in Amazon warehouses, in greenhouses, whether they do it as peasant farmers or small-scale fishers. All of these people are embedded in the system, and all of them are doing the work that makes the system continue, and therefore all of them have the power to transform the system. And I'll add that goes equally for people who are doing the paid and unpaid care work that supports all of those workers and makes it possible for them to turn up at work every morning. Also critical. And in many places, those are the people who are also bearing the cost of environmental destruction. So, I guess what I wanted to kind of wrap up with, because I should be wrapping up, is one of the questions that the organizers posed to us is how do we protect the most vulnerable in the process of just transition? And what I want to say is that while these people are vulnerable, they're also powerful. And if we think about protecting them, we also need to think about putting their voices, their visions, and their aspirations for social change at the center of a vision of just transition. And that means deeply, deeply trying to integrate democratic processes, inclusive and participatory processes that will reach the widest possible range of people who are embedded in different positions and different situations in the system and figure out how to include their visions in the vision of change. I'm sure that was more than 4 minutes, so I will stop.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll try to build on it because, like, we're not just colleagues but also comrades, and I think that I really strongly, like, both the introduction and what Katie said really resonate very well with me. So just as a starting point of our talk, I see this as a space for also critical reflection. The crises that we are in require such tremendous strategic action. I think in spaces like this, it's important to also talk about how effective we are at doing what we want. So if I criticize any of you into the spirit of comradely discussion, it's not to fault anyone personally, but I'll try to, looking also from the perspective of trade unions, to see how we can go about with this just transition that is so urgently needed. And as was already mentioned, it's not just the climate crisis that we're in that we need to overcome. There's many other crises that we're currently in. Many of you might be looking for a house. There's a housing crisis which is very urgent here in the Netherlands, and I think it's critical that we integrate that in our thinking about the just transition. We are currently coming out of a major health crisis. A lot of health workers have had a very tough time the past 2 years. Many people have died from this virus, and I think it's also important to take that on board in our analysis of the way forward in which, like, where we want to go and what system we want to come out of. Because for many people in their day-to-day lives, I think the environmental crisis is not something that they relate to on a day-to-day basis. It is for many people in the global south, it is for many people living on the front lines, it is for people living in Groningen, the biggest gas extraction site in Europe. But also, I think we have to be realistic that for many people, the sense of crisis is not there. So the people who were out this week on the streets here in Den Haag, who feel that urgency to act, I think it's important to recognize that that is happening, and much more people are being mobilized by the urgency of the crises. But also, a great deal of people are not. They don't have the sensation of urgency yet. And I think that is where we need to reach beyond our bubble, and I think the trade union and the trade union movement can very much help in that. And to give you an example of how we, from a trade union perspective, go about, I want to talk a little bit about the most polluting in terms of CO2 pollution, and also in terms of air pollution site of industry here in the Netherlands, which is the Tata Steel plant in IJmuiden. It employs 9,000 people, and it creates a product that is, for the foreseeable future, still something that we depend on in our lives, steel. The plant owners in India wanted to do a very slow transition with based on technologies that were proven, such as carbon capture and storage in used up gas fields, put the carbon there underground, and say we'll deal with it in the future. We, as a trade union, we understood that this plant, which is very polluting to both the environment and the people living around it, people in the area, they die many years before people in unpolluted areas. They live much longer in sickness than many other people, so we understand that there's a need to change. But also, since 9,000 people are employed at the plant, and since steel is something that will be needed for windmills in the future, we want this plant to transition. We want the workers to have a future. So we sat down with workers and developed a plan, a very ambitious but grounded in realistic science plan for transition. So we have that on the books now. It will go completely carbon neutral in 2030, which is years ahead of the plan that the plant owners had. It is not based on speculative science such as carbon capture and storage. It is about making steel from wind energy, and in the near future, about 2024, 25, we hope also some hydrogen-based energy, and then progressing as that becomes available, but only as it becomes available. the energy that is needed for the steel production that is very energy intense mostly will come off of windmills that are directly located near the site of industry, so there's very little loss in energy, so it's very energy efficient. So this plan was developed with the workers and scientists, but also critically with help from the environmental justice movement. So organizations like Milieudefensie, Greenpeace, Natuur en Milieu all came out in favor of this, which is very important for the workers there, because they understood that this was not something that they were going to battle their management on alone. This was something that they could develop a relationship with people in the community and wider. And also that helped to show Dutch politicians that this is a viable plan, because the market will not solve this. We need government intervention. We might even need substantial state takeover of this plan. And the plans for that are well underway, and I think there's a political majority now. And this will ensure that these 9,000 workers will not only not lose their job, but will produce in a sustainable way, and produce for something that we can then build wind farms of. Because part of the plan also says, why not build industry sites right next to the steel plant so that we can build more wind farms, so that our dependency on wind energy can effectively grow in the pace that is needed for the urgent restructuring of our energy cycle. So that's how we as a trade union go about with these topics.
I will continue build on what my former speakers have said, and I'm very, very grateful for the introduction that Katie has given of the definition of what a just transition is. And I would like to speak more than to the question of where we currently at with the just transition, because I think that's something you have asked before. And personally I have growing concerns there, because I think, what Katie said, the just transition is really about developing and pushing for a vision of a new energy system, but like a global power structure. And what Katie hasn't mentioned before, this can be the just transition, I think, will have to vary depending on the local context. So I think there is not one silver bullet, one clear vision, and then realizing that becomes a very challenging process, or also like bringing powers together to really agree on a vision. And so I think there currently we're really still struggling here in the Netherlands, or on a wider international level, to develop such a more unified vision. Of course, projects like the Green New Deal are working on that. But then next to that, of course, the one aspect of the just transition is developing that vision, and the second step would be, of course, like finding out what the pathways to it are. And there I also have concerns that we are, unfortunately, in terms of discourse and how far we have moved with society, we are being slow. So in a nutshell, this is really what we with Shell Must Fall and the Future Build Shell project we're trying to do in just focus really on Royal Dutch Shell. On the one hand side, with the Shell Must Fall campaign, like trying to develop this vision of like, we actually need to dismantle this old measure. Like we cannot nudge it into the right direction, but it actually needs to go. And then next to that, launching a research project to actually investigate, so how do we get to that future? So this is what we will do in the podcast, where we just investigate different routes like carbon pricing, nationalizing, bankrupting, cutting subsidies, on how to get there. And I think this is what, I think we need more initiatives like this. I think with XI, with Kudo, with different movements in the Netherlands, we are a little bit stuck on this level of maybe projecting a vision, but what we are still really lacking, I think, is also a more concrete analysis of the steps on how to get there. And I think this is really necessary in further developing our campaigns and make them more concrete, for people to really have greater mobilizing yeah, I just want to reiterate what Katie already said. I was also a bit concerned about the framing of the one question, like how can we protect the people that are most vulnerable or most targeted by the climate disruption? And yeah, I want us, first of all, who's the we? And if the we is white people in the global north, yeah, we have to see that it has been our democratically elected governments, corporations that have the headquarters here in the Netherlands, in the European Union, that have led and pushed for the climate crisis that we're in. So I find it kind of, yeah, I think it's not right to then say how can we protect them while we carry such a large responsibility or have such a large stake in where we are actually at. So I think it's really important when we organize actions here in the Netherlands, it should be also come with this acknowledgement of historical guilt, but also, yeah, really frame it more in the context of international solidarity. Yeah, I think this is.
Yeah, well, that was great for the three of you. It makes just transition like a bit more concrete, also with this example of data steal, and maybe like as a follow-up question. In introduction, I already mentioned maybe some difficulties, like of course unequal power relations, corporates that are kind of interpreting the concept as like managed capitalism, or like they abuse the concept. And you mentioned also very interesting things like the struggle to define the vision and the issue and the pathways, and then who is the we, and shouldn't we also, is it right to say decolonize just transition? So those are very interesting issues. So maybe as a follow-up question, could you maybe also for the two of you elaborate on like what stands in the way, what do you see as like the greatest obstacles for achieving a just transition?
Yeah, another very important question. And I'll speak again a little bit at the international and the kind of conceptual scale. I think you already put your finger on the kind of the main issue, which is to say the people in power currently benefit enormously from the present system. And if we say we need to fundamentally redistribute power in our society, obviously the people who currently hold power are not going to support that. So that is the fundamental challenge. What I want to talk about to kind of flesh that out a little bit is two of what we call kind of false solutions, or other visions of climate action, which I think are standing in the way of just transition and standing in the way specifically by dominating the discussion at international and also often enough at national levels. And the main one that I want to unpack a little bit is what we could call a green economy, or a kind of neoliberal market-driven vision of climate action. This is what I see as really opposed to just transition, but it's often what is being passed off as just transition when Shell or somebody puts out, or BP puts out their plan for just transition, as they have done. Speaking of the struggle for the language. So under a kind of green economy vision, corporations and the private sector are seen as the key ultimate drivers of positive change in climate action, with a kind of a supportive role being seen for states as regulators and as granting subsidies to private corporations. And this kind of vision of action relies on the idea that new technologies will allow us to decarbonize our economy without fundamentally changing anything else. You won't, I think, be surprised to hear me say there's a couple issues with this. And I suspect everyone here knows that, but I will unpack them a little bit and offer a little bit of evidence. The kind of main and urgent issue is that it just isn't happening at all, actually. So the narrative that we sometimes have is there will be a transition, but we don't want it to be an unjust one. Actually, if you look at climate action, or at the action that's been taken by governments and the changes that have happened in our economy over the last 20 years, we haven't managed a transition of any kind. There's been a huge increase in renewable capacity, which is fantastic, but it's increased slower than the total energy demand. So the amount of fossil fuels being burned every day is still increasing. And the amount of emissions is still increasing day over day. So it's not happening. We have a depressing but important report on that coming out in about 2 weeks' time. Then at the same time, the progress that we have made on renewables has also come with significant costs, and this is the kind of exporting of costs to the global south that Marisol also alluded to. So whether that means building hundreds of hectares of solar panels on occupied land in the Western Sahara, or whether it means destroying the Bolivian highlands for lithium for electronic cars or electric cars. None of the technologies that we have available are free of ecological and social costs. So the idea that we can just switch our economy simply from one set of technologies to another and therefore avoid all of the different ecological costs is just not founded in reality. And then, lastly, a lot of the solutions that are being put on the table right now, as Niels also alluded to, by corporations, but increasingly also by governments, are built around the idea of net zero, which is to say the idea that we will somehow be able to absorb enough carbon that we can continue emitting at something close to our current rate, and it will work out. Presently, there is no technology that will allow us to do that. As Niels pointed out, direct air carbon capture technology is still really in its infancy, and the scale at which it's currently working is nothing approaching being able to make a dent in the carbon emissions. And on the other hand, nature-based solutions, which are increasingly popular, which you will hear a lot about in the coming COP, are actually in a kind of similar boat. They are mostly talking now about tree planting and about restoration of ecosystems, which is fabulous and should happen. But in order to do the kind of carbon drawdown that we need to do, we would need to reforest, we have the number, 678 million hectares of land, which is twice the size of India. So, especially when we're thinking from the perspective of a country like the Netherlands, we have to realize we're talking about other people's land, and they may in fact have other plans for it. So there are a lot of problematic social justice implications there. I will wrap up my depressing 5 minutes by saying one more depressing piece, which is just to say that aside from this kind of neoliberal solution, or not aside from it, complementary to it, there's also a real risk of increasing authoritarianism. And what we've seen so far is increasing government and military strength to defend borders against climate refugees. That's been a huge and documented trend in the last 15 years and has arguably been the main climate response by governments. But as the climate crisis intensifies, there's also a risk that governments will start imposing more authoritarian regimes using the ideas of kind of wartime economies to push through climate-friendly measures that take place entirely at the expense of people's rights. And from what we know, that will be at the expense of certain groups far more than others. So these are some of the kind of risks, some of the major alternative frameworks that are shaping actual climate action right now, and what Just Transition tries to replace and contribute.
I see somebody with a question. Do we take questions now, or?
At the end, you see the well.
Save it for a little bit, but I'll try to speed up so that we can come to the questions, because I think a debate is indeed important. What stands in the way of a just transition? I already alluded that, I think we need to escape not just the climate crisis, but also other crises. And I think, at least in terms of overcoming an economy that is fundamentally unjust and exploitative and extractive, such as this carbon industry, there's other parts of our economic life that many people do valuable work in that need to be strengthened, such as care work, work in the healthcare sector, work in education that is usually at least a lot lower in carbon output. And I think as a trade union, we really want to strengthen and value those people doing that kind of work and say that is a sector of our economic life that needs to be strengthened. But in order to do that, as these are public sectors, we need public spending. And we're currently living in a system, a capitalist economic system, where capitalist enterprises do their utmost to avoid in any meaningful way contributing or participating in a form of societal deal where they pay their fair share of taxes. And it's important to understand that the Netherlands in the global capitalist economy plays a pivotal role for these multinational enterprises in shifting away their taxes. The Netherlands is a tax haven, and not just a tax haven, it's also a haven for these exploitative and extractive companies to sue other countries their tax money away when these countries take decisions that go against the profit making of these companies. That's done by international investment treaties. The Netherlands is one of the leading countries to push that. The country that hosts behind the United States in total number of investment claims by these transnational companies, just behind the US is the Netherlands, as being used as a country that helps these companies take taxpayers' money from other countries away and pocket it to the people who own these companies. So the Netherlands is not guilt-free by far. It is one of the worst perpetrators of shifting away money that is needed to do necessary work, such as care work, such as education, such as replanting forests. The money for that is being stolen by companies through the Netherlands as a tax haven, as an investment paradise. So we need to look at how we can come to terms with financial capital. And I think one, at least as a trade unionist, one of the ways we can do that is to look at finances that we have democratic control over. And in the Netherlands we have pension funds. And pension funds are co-managed by the trade unions. They hold one of the biggest financial investment portfolios in the world. Dutch ABP is one of the biggest single investors in the world. And as trade unionists, we've pushed for last week at the Trade Union Parliament for a resolution saying we need to defund by 2025 the investments from the Dutch pension funds away from fossil fuel industry. Now the trade union leadership didn't go as far as to say, yes, we're going to do that, but they have come out and said, under the pressure of our members, under the crisis that is there, we need to make the ultimate push to push the investment from these pension funds away from fossil fuel industries. They've developed a traffic light system, and they're being very serious of ridding their portfolio of investments of all the ones that are currently in the red, fossil fuel companies that cannot be reformed. And I think that's one way of getting democratic ownership over capital. It's already there. It's been democratically co-owned by the trade unions. And I think that is one way of shifting the power that is now in the private hands of capital to public managed funds such as pension funds by trade unions.
Yeah, what else to say? Well, importantly, I just want to underline again what we are lacking in, or what I see as one of the greatest obstacles in a just transition is political will. I think climate disruption or the climate crisis is basically a choice of the current most powerful political decision makers in our country. They have known for decades and they haven't acted. So I think it's an illusion not to talk about choice to a certain extent. I think the second biggest obstacle, not the second biggest, but the second obstacle that I see, and I mentioned it before, I think we are, particularly in the Netherlands, we are still in an imaginary crisis of like, what is really the vision of our future and how do we get there And I think there really movements such as XR have an absolutely crucial role to expand, to put out bold messages, to tickle the imagination of the population, to think beyond a capitalist system, to think beyond neoliberal ideas. And I think one of the sub-questions that we were given was who we see as the main actors of a just transition. And I do see a crucial role for three players in moving us forward, and that is on the one hand, which has been mentioned, frontline communities, people that are most impacted currently by the climate crisis, because they know best what is wrong with the system. I think there is another crucial role for movements such as XR, political organizers. It is a skill to really amplify the voices, the ideas that are coming from the front lines, and to help building political counterpower. Because often also people at the front lines, they do not have the capacity, they're struggling with day-to-day issues. So I think it's great if in solidarity movements then act and help to do that particular political work in mobilizing. And I think a third important player are researchers and progressive policymakers in further developing these ideas on how we get to the future. Because it requires resources, it requires knowledge, capacity that people at the front lines do not necessarily have, or people that are very focused on movement building also don't necessarily have. It requires different skills. So I would wish for a closer collaboration of these players in the Netherlands, but also beyond. And I think that's currently still lacking. And I don't necessarily want to talk too much about Future Beyond Show, but this is what I can offer from my experience, where I've been very grateful that the campaign was launched by Kolero, but that we had the support of the think tanks like TNI that helped us in further developing these ideas, and I think this is exactly the close collaboration that we need more in future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm very happy with this last part, because indeed, it started off quite depressing, and I understand indeed there are many struggles. Technology that does not yet exist, nature-based solutions, and technology that basically now can be unjust in its implementation, the tax haven, political unwill, the lack of a vision. But then, Marisol, you also gave some examples of then what can be done and who could do it. Communities that are affected, researchers, the policymakers. So maybe Niels and Katie, could you add to that? How do you imagine this mobilization? How can it be done? And maybe also Extinction Rebellion, what more can we do and which strategies could we apply?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, not just because I'm worse at talking about positive things, but also because I really like to have some time for questions and some open conversation. I think Marisol has really pointed us in a very important direction about the kinds of collaboration that help to give rise to new and to more positive visions. I think in terms of having effective movements and effective mobilization, that idea of offering a positive alternative that seems to people to be viable, to be realistic, and to meet their kind of direct and immediate needs at the same time as tackling the climate crisis. I think that's really at the heart of what it means to be able to build concrete proposals behind which larger groups of people can mobilize, which I think is what we need. So that building of very concrete visions, collaborations, and solutions is critical. I think there's a great deal of that already happening in the Netherlands, and I think Niels and Marisol can say more about it than I can. The one area that I could, or that I can speak to briefly, is about collaborations between climate movements and small-scale farmers, because this is an immensely valuable kind of area of collaboration. where small-scale agroecological, organic, or otherwise small-scale independent farmers have kind of realized that people have realized that this is going to be a really critical part of a just transition, is having a food system which is also decarbonized, which is locally based, and which is grounded in kind of principles of food sovereignty and of healthy food for all. And there's therefore kind of a natural alliance between small-scale farmers and climate movements in general. And that's something that you can really see building in a collaboration between the different movements here on the ground in the Netherlands. So, for example, tomorrow there will be an agroecology conference where I know many from XR and XR Landbouw will also be participating. So that's a nice concrete example of how people can come together to build proposals to tackle the solutions that are, to tackle the obstacles that are standing in the way of solutions for both climate action and for other kinds of problems. I wanted to talk to you about Cooperation Jackson, but I would rather leave time for discussion, and I'll just tell you to look up Cooperation Jackson, because it's an example from the US that's a really beautiful example of the same principle of how you can find one solution that responds to many problems. And those are the kinds of solutions behind which you can really mobilize large groups. So I think that's a great model, but I will save it for the discussion.
Yeah, I'll also try to be very, very brief. I think in terms of the period we're coming out of, where both XR and Fridays for Futures have really spilled people and their thousands and tens of thousands into the street, into a wave of protest, I think that is magnificent and beautiful and was very urgently needed. Breath of fresh air to the movements. But I think for the not too far future, I think that part of the protest is reaching the end of its effectiveness, and I think we need to win shit. I think we need to target specific goals in campaigns such as Shell, and I think like Shell Must Fall does a brilliant way in focusing our energy onto a company that's one of the worst. But I also want to reiterate like what I spoke to earlier in relation to the work that we do as a trade union. Like winning major investment decisions of the biggest investors on the planet to shift away from fossil industry towards green sectors and public financing of climate-friendly jobs, such as like raising the salary of teachers and nurses. I think those manifestations of serious wins that are not in the abstract but very concrete, I think are very necessary for us to sustain the movement, because I'm like with the perspective of the fact that trade unions have existed for over a century. I think like this level of intensity that's related to protest, I think it will, if we don't build structures of regeneration and security, it's gonna burst us out before we reach the point where we can really influence those in power. And for that we need very serious alliance building, and we need to create structures such as trade unions, which have existed for well over a century and are now finally, they're late to the game, could have been with y'all like a lot earlier, and like, you know, shift our base towards interventions that are necessary, but we're here now. We're a part of the NatMars like mobilization. The fact that the trade union is actively calling out its membership for climate-related issues, I think it's very important. And I think that type of solidarity is also needed in reverse. The trade unions are bleeding members at this moment. We used to be much stronger, and that's simply because young people are not signing up to become members. And that means that when we go out to strike, we have less financial support for our members. Like this plan for Tata Steel was done in years where trade union members in the steel sector especially went out on strike. They they stopped their industries from working, which is, with all the great things that XR has done, you've never succeeded in stopping a single industry from working a single day. Trade unions do that every year. And that's because we organize in such a way that we can actively bring down these industries, bring them to a halt if our members democratically choose to do so. So join us and make sure that structures such as trade unions not only shift to more climate-friendly policy, but also have sustainable funds so that we can do this shit in the future. Well, I have membership sign-up forms here.
Yeah, I think looking at time, we'll pass on to the questions. So there's, before the break, room for 1 or 2 questions, and I also want to invite you to stick around, and after the presentation by Nancy, also join the Q&A session. So yeah, I believe there was a question there. Do you still want to ask it? Yeah?
Yeah, comrades, and I thank you greatly for reminding me that that's what we are. Yeah, I had some time to think about my questions. I got a bit longer than I thought it would be, but so if carbon capture and storage technologies are a pipe dream, then so is net zero, and we should stop talking about it. Is that, like, I don't know how to phrase that other question. If XR has a job to tickle minds, then we should mind our words and speak from the heart. My heart doesn't know net zero, it knows stop. An alternative to the climate crisis and societal collapse must be an alternative to capitalism, the hierarchical, for-profit, extractivist mode of organization. So a better life is what mobilizes people in the crisis. So we should model the future that we desire by speaking openly about the love that drives us. I'm sorry, there's no question mark in this.
Okay. So does anyone want to react to that? Yeah? Okay.
Thanks. As you say, not all the question, but I think I agree with with basically everything you said. Net zero is tricky, right? It's tricky because I don't know that I would say that every form of carbon capture is a complete pipe dream, but as it's being used currently, the possible existence of carbon capture is being used to justify just continuing present emissions. And that must not be allowed to happen, right? So that there might eventually be a plan for the functioning of our planet that includes carbon capture, I think is completely possible. But that we should build it into our plans currently, and the way it is being built in is that fossil fuel companies especially are planning to continue emitting at basically the same rates, and then if you look at their own graphs and projections, the plan is to suddenly implement this massive scale carbon capture of a scale that, as far as we know, is not possible, and to do it 15 or 20 years in the future. And that doesn't make any sense. And insofar as net zero is being used to justify that, I think we do need to be extremely, extremely careful about the term. There's a very good paper about it called, a lot of my answers go this way, but called Seize the Means of Carbon Removal by Wim Carden and Andreas Wall, and I recommend it as an interesting exploration of the question.
Can you repeat the title?
Seize the Means of Carbon Removal.
Seize the means. Thank you.
Okay. You want to add to that? No?
2 words, 20 words. Like, in the future we need to also like imagine indeed like what does it look like. And I think like, for instance, workers in the oil industry working on oil rigs, they're highly trained in, for instance, fighting fires on their drilling sites because it's very dangerous if you're out in the ocean. I think they would make excellent firefighters with all the wildfires going about. And I think we actively and empathically need to talk to people afraid of losing their, not just their job, but their calling in life. Because this is work that they love, We need to replace it with something else that they love to do, which in this case is like highly trained, dangerous, adrenaline run, very masculine. I'm not a proponent of like creating a more masculine society, but for these people in these industries, it makes sense to talk and speak to their heart and have a future for them that appeals to them.
You want to add to that?
Yeah. Well, in terms of finding a solution, right? I'm on my own journey and with the project with the Future Beyond Show podcast that we're working on. It is exactly investigating these options. Like we will, in the different episodes we will launch, we will discuss, can we nationalize shell? What are the risks and opportunities in this? But also carbon trading and pricing, we will have that. Not necessarily because I or we believed in it in the onset of this project, but it's also about recognizing where we are in terms of discourse, right? The EU is just busy with expanding the European carbon trade system. So while I totally agree with you in some way that we should not mention it, but then or like lose it from our vocabulary, I think it's also important to recognize that these are the core tools that are currently being negotiated for the upcoming COP. So I think it's still important to also try to debunk some myth behind it. And with whatever solution or pathway we will choose, I think there's also not one silver bullet, that we have to seriously consider that it will probably be a combination of many. So it's just good to be clear about the risk and potential of various tools.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. Because of time, I want to leave it here, and we will continue with questions after the presentation by Nancy. But personally, I got a lot of insights. I learned a lot. I know what to read and where to look for, but also I got some clues on actually like what to do to achieve just transition. So that feels really great and helpful. So thank you very much. So we will have a very short break, 4 minutes, and in the meanwhile I will get Nancy online. So can I have a big applause for our three panelists?
No, I think it's alright.
I mean, effectively, nobody knows what but so far, that is not
So that's what they were really going on, is the fact that the voters have been protected. It's always scary about it. Any sort of big disruptive changes happen. Propels itself.
They are. And they're good.
Oh my god, okay.
They are in one of the they're actually quite don't rock the boat type of, and
That's not the point.
spills over into the culture that you have.
At least in my opinion, that's what happens there for that direction. And it's like really.
They're with us. Government policies, which is why we need public finance for the crisis we have.
Okay, so this was the very short break. I hope that was enough. So let's start again. Well, we have Nancy Fraser online. Yeah. So let's start then with her presentation and the session of questions and answer to Nancy and the other panelists. So Nancy, I will give you the word, but first I want to do a very short introduction. Well, Nancy Fraser, and really we're very, very honored to have her here. She's a very well-known American philosopher, a critical theorist, feminist, and Henry A. and Louise Schlapp Professor of Political and Social Science and Professor of Philosophy at the New School in New York City. She's very widely known for her critics of identity politics and philosophical work on the concept of justice. She's also a critic of contemporary liberal feminism and its abandonment of social justice issues, while she holds honorary doctoral degrees from 4 universities in 3 countries and has written about 11 books, correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy, and her work has been translated into like more than 20 languages, and she's recipient of many degrees, awards and prizes. So really the importance and the extent of her work, it's well too much to tell you in this introduction. There's much more. So as I said, Nancy, we're very, very happy to have you here. And having said that, well, I give you the word. I hope you have been able to hear what I said.
Yes, recording in progress.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. Then, well, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thanks to your whole team who organized this. Thanks for inviting me and to the group there in what looks like a very nice place. Thank you for coming. My lecture is called Against the Environmentalism of the Rich, What Capitalism's History Can Teach Us About Eco-Politics. And pretty much everything I have to say here is a gloss on that title. It contains several terms that I want to elaborate and explain, beginning with the word eco-politics. That term is widely used, and I intended to refer to the whole array of contemporary political perspectives and projects that include a response of some kind to climate change, that treat it as real and as requiring action. So I need to stress the huge variety of orientations that fall under that definition of eco-politics that presently occupy our political landscape. For example, the militant young activists epitomized by Greta Thunberg, who demand immediate radical action on carbon emissions, but also movements for degrowth that pin the rap on consumers' lifestyles and propose to transform our ways of living. Indigenous communities that defend their habitats from corporate extractivism and advocate non-instrumental ways of relating to nature. Also feminists who are mobilizing for forms of life that sustain reproduction, both social and natural. Black Lives militants who target environmental racism. Social democrats who militate for a Green New Deal. Right-wing populists who aim to preserve their own green spaces and natural resources by excluding racialized others. Governments in the global south who claim a right to development, popular movements that advocate commoning or a social and solidarity economy. Also, commercial interests that utilize neoliberal carbon offset schemes to enclose land, dispossess those who live for them, and capture new forms of monopoly rent. Also, corporate and financial interests that speculate in eco-commodities and aim to ensure that the global climate regime remains market-centered and capital-friendly. That's not even a full list, but what it shows, at the very least, is that eco-politics is all over the map. It is a large and confused field containing perspectives that not only diverge, but often conflict with one another. Now, I suggest that this field is still relatively open and unsettled. Nothing decisive will happen until and unless it gets organized, until the mass of conflicting eco-opinion resolves into a relatively clear set of opposing camps, separated by a relatively clear fault line. So the pressing question is, which perspectives will predominate? Which will succeed in winning over enough of the others to create a hegemonic bloc that can support a shared project? In this situation, safeguarding the planet requires constructing a new counter-hegemonic common sense that can orient a broadly shared project of social and ecological transformation. Such a common sense has to cut through the mass of conflicting views and identify exactly what in society must be changed in order to stop global warming. In other words, it has to link the authoritative findings of climate science to an equally authoritative account of the socio-historical drivers of climate change. To become fully counter-hegemonic, however, a new common sense must transcend the merely environmental. Addressing the full extent of the present crisis, it must connect its ecological diagnosis to other vital concerns, including livelihood insecurity and denial of labor rights, public disinvestment from social reproduction and chronic undervaluation of care work, ethno-racial imperial oppression and gender and sex domination, dispossession, expulsion, and exclusion of migrants, militarization, political authoritarianism, and police brutality. All of those concerns are intertwined with and exacerbated by climate change. So the new common sense that I'm imagining has to avoid reductive ecologism. Far from treating global warming as a trump card that overrides everything else, it has to trace that threat to underlying societal dynamics that also drive other strands of the present crisis. Only by addressing all major facets of this crisis, both environmental and non-environmental, and by disclosing the connections among them, can we envision a counter-hegemonic bloc that backs a common project and possesses the political heft to pursue it effectively. Now, this is a very tall order, to be sure, but what brings it within the realm of the possible is a happy, or if you prefer, unhappy coincidence. Namely, all roads lead to one idea, namely capitalism. Capitalism, in the sense I'm going to explain, represents the principal socio-historical driver of climate change, hence the core institutionalized dynamic that must be dismantled in order to stop and repair it. But capitalism, so defined, is also deeply implicated in seemingly non-ecological forms of social injustice, from class exploitation to racial imperial oppression and gender and sexual domination. And capitalism figures centrally, too, in seemingly non-ecological societal impasses, in crises of care and social reproduction, of finance, supply chains, wages, and work, of governance and de-democratization. Anti-capitalism, therefore, could, indeed should, become the central organizing motif of a new common sense. Disclosing the links among multiple strands of injustice and irrationality, it represents the key to developing a powerful counter-hegemonic project of eco-societal transformation. That is the argument I want to elaborate here. First, however, I want to explain the phrase, the environmentalism of the rich. This expression inverts Juan Martinez Allier's well-known term in the environmentalism of the poor. What Martinez Allier meant by that idea was the struggles of poor communities, mainly but not only in the global south, to counter neo-imperial corporate assaults on their natural surroundings, not in the sense of abstract nature, but rather as habitats inextricably entwined with their ways of life, their livelihoods, their communities, their social reproduction and political and cultural identities. In other words, the environmentalism of the poor is integrative. It brings together a set of interlinked existential concerns, including some that we would call ecological and others that we might not call that. Rather than separate out harms to non-human nature, it treats these as deeply entangled with harms to human communities. Now, by contrast, what I'm calling the environmental of the rich is single-issue environmentalism. Environmentalism as nature defense, capital N, capital D, uncontaminated by any other supposedly extraneous concerns such as social justice, livelihood security, democracy, social reproduction of human communities. Now, my claim is that those other concerns only appear to be extraneous to those whose livelihoods, political rights, and community survival are not existentially threatened. Just as single-issue feminism can only be a feminism of the relatively privileged, which I also call feminism of the 1%, so single-issue environmentalism can only be an environmentalism of the rich. In both cases, what purports to be an emancipatory movement actually represents the interests of a small elite and is harmful to the vast majority. So these two terms, environmentalism of the poor and environmentalism of the rich, form a pair. They stand in opposition to one another. The pair suggests one possible way of simplifying and organizing the eco-political field. In that case, their opposition would become the paramount division, the central fault line around which the whole of eco-politics would be organized, the line in relation to which every ecological perspective would have to situate it. The key question for eco-politics then would be, which side are you on? Now that question brings us finally, or back, I should say, to capitalism. As they function in our context, rich and poor are populist surrogates for class categories. In that sense, they're on a par with categories like the 99% versus the 1%. Like all populist language, these terms are simplified and lacking in analytical precision, but they have tremendous mobilizing power, in part because they direct our attention to the structure of the field in which eco-politics plays out. These terms rightly suggest that this is a deeply unjust field in which a relatively small number of humans live comfortably and long, while the vast majority suffer and die young. Now, I'm going to suggest that the best name for this social field is capitalist society. Capitalism, I claim, is a social formation that has brought us global warming. Contra those who speak vaguely of anthropogenic climate change, the principal socio-historical agents of global warming is not humanity in general, but small class of entrepreneurs who have engineered and profit from the system of production and transport that is bombarding the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. They have not done this contingently as a result of some freak accident. Rather, they have been strongly incentivized to do so by a social system that gives them means, motive, and opportunity to savage the planet. Let me briefly explain why. Capitalist societies split the economy off from the latter's non-economic background conditions, including that of nature. At the same time, they established a contradictory relation between those realms, the economy on one side, nature on the other. On the one hand, the accumulation of capital relies on nature, both as a tap which supplies material and energetic inputs to commodity production, but also as a sink for absorbing the latter's waste. Now, on the other hand, capitalist society incentivizes owners bent on maximizing profits to commandeer nature's gifts as cheaply as possible, while absolving them of any obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. Premised on the false assumption that nature can replenish itself autonomously and without end, capital is more than a relation to labor, as Marxists have assumed. It is also a relation to nature, a predatory extractive relation, which consumes ever more biophysical wealth in order to pile up ever more profits. But what also piles up, not accidentally, is an ever-growing mountain of eco-wreckage. There is, I'm suggesting, an ecological contradiction lodged at the heart of capitalist society in the relation this society establishes between economy and nature. The contradiction, in other words, is structural, built into the DNA of capitalist society. And that means that we cannot save the planet without disabling some core defining features of this social system. Here then is my first conclusion. Eco-politics must be anti-capitalist. But that's not all. Capitalism's ecological contradiction is entangled with several others which are equally structural and deeply entrenched. These too tend to precipitate crises and struggles which entwine with the ecological. I'm thinking first of capitalism's social reproductive contradiction, which is rooted in the system's gender divide between commodity production on one side and unpaid care work on the other. This arrangement is one in which production presupposes reproduction, which forms and replenishes the system's human subjects including the paid workers from whom capital extracts surplus value. Yet capital accords care work very or very little monetized value, treats it as free and infinitely available, and assumes no responsibility for sustaining it. So it's always prone to destabilize social reproduction, just as it tends non-accidentally to destabilize natural ecosystems. In fact, the two processes are hard to separate. When capital destabilizes the ecosystems that support human habitats, it simultaneously jeopardizes caregiving, as well as the livelihoods and social relations that sustain it. When people fight back, conversely, it is often to defend the entire eco-social nexus at a single stroke, as if to defy the authority of capitalism's divisions. In other words, crises of nature and crises of care are intertwined. Now, these effects are especially rough on racialized populations whom capitalism renders politically defenseless and available for plunder. The system develops in part by annexing chunks of nature for whose reproduction it does not pay. In appropriating nature, however, capital simultaneously expropriates human communities for whom the confiscated material and befouled surround constitute a habitat, their means of production and of livelihood, and the material basis for their social reproduction. So these communities bear a hugely disproportionate share of the global environmental load. Their expropriation affords other, let us say, whiter communities the chance to be sheltered, at least for a while, from the worst effects of capital's cannibalization of nature. The system's built-in tendency to ecological crisis is therefore tightly linked to its built-in tendency to create racially marked populations for expropriation. In other words, I'm suggesting that capitalism's ecological contradiction cannot be neatly separated from the system's other constitutive irrationalities and injustice. To ignore the latter by adopting the reductive ecologistic perspective of single-issue environmentalism is to miss the distinctive institutional structure of capitalist society, dividing economy not only from nature, but also from state, care, and racial imperial expropriation. This society institutes a tangle of mutually interacting contradictions, which we need to be able to hold together in a single frame. Hence, my second conclusion. Ecopolitics must not only be anti-capitalist, but also trans-environmental. Now, both of those ideas gain support when we turn to capitalism's history, which I want to do now. In its earliest mercantilist phase, which ran from the 16th through the 18th centuries, agriculture and manufacturing ran mainly on animal muscle, both human and otherwise, oxen, horses, and so on, just as they have for millennia. So the only way available energy was through conquest. Only only by annexing land and commandeering additional supplies of labor could mercantile capitalist powers increase their forces of production. Of course, they did so with a vengeance on a vastly expanded scale, which included the so-called New World as well as the Old. In the system's periphery, these powers installed brutal systems of socio-ecological extractivism. Working land and labor to the point of exhaustion, they left trails of environmental and social wreckage across whole continents. In the system's core regions, meanwhile, those powers forcibly enclosed common lands, dispossessed tenants and farmers of customary use rights, and upended the life worlds and communities of rural populations. In both cases, periphery and core, those on the receiving end fought back, aimed at countering wholesale assaults on habitats, communities, and livelihoods. Their resistance was necessarily integrated, combining what we would now call environmental struggles with struggles over labor, social reproduction, and political power. In a word, then, these were environmentalisms of the poor. Now, liberal colonial capitalism supplanted mercantilism in the early 19th century. In this era, England pioneered the world historic shift to fossil energy, which appeared to liberate the forces of production from the constraints of land and labor. But this appearance was illusory. Industrialization in the core rested on extractivism in the periphery. What made Manchester's factories hum was a massive import of cheap cotton to feed the mills, cotton produced on the basis of slave labor in the New World, cheap sugar, tobacco, and tea to stimulate the hands who worked the mills, also produced on the basis of slave labor in the periphery, and cheap bird shit to feed the soil that fed the workers, produced through Chinese coolie, semi-enslaved labor in Peru. In other words, the apparent savings of labor and land was actually a form of environmental load displacement, a shift in the demands placed on biomass from core to periphery. Theorists and historians of eco-imperialism are only now beginning to reckon the full extent of this cost shifting, while also revealing the close connection of anti-colonialism with proto-environmentalism. Moral struggles against liberal colonial predation were also, we now begin to understand, environmentalisms of the poor. In the capitalist core, however, proto-environmentalism looked rather different, conceiving nature with a capital N as sublime and beyond price, hence as demanding reverence and protection. This perspective fed romantic conservative critiques of industrial society and eventually standalone environmentalisms of the rich, which focused on wilderness preservation. Although it is often thought to exhaust the whole of proto-environmentalism in this era, this romantic version coexisted in reality with another perspective, which linked capital's assault on nature with class injustice. Key proponents of that second perspective were, in England, William Morris, whose eco-socialism included a powerful aesthetic dimension, and Friedrich Engels, whose social environmentalism focused initially on industrialism's bad impact on urban working class health, and later on what he called the dialectics of nature, or what we would now call co-evolutionism. Both those thinkers and many others I could cite seeded rich traditions of socialist ecology, which were subsequently obscured by narrow single-issue understandings of environmentalism, but which are now being recovered and extended. And I would recommend John Beverly Foster's brilliant new book on this environmentalism of the working class, socialist environmentalism. In any case, Global colonial capitalism gave way to a new state-managed regime after the end of the First World War and the beginning of the 20th century. This was the period when the U.S. displaced Britain as global hegemon and orchestrated a vast expansion in greenhouse gas emissions built around the internal combustion engine and refined oil. Now, that part is widely known. What may be less well known, at least outside the U.S., is that the country also begat a powerful environmental movement. One current centered on wilderness protection through the creation of reserves and national parks, usually by means of the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their lands. This environmentalism of the rich aimed at enabling at least some Americans to escape industrial civilization temporarily by vacationing in national parks. It never confronted industrial civilization directly, nor sought to transform it. But a second current of U.S. environmentalism targeted the industrial nucleus of the regime and pushed for state action to curtail corporate pollution. Maybe some of you know Rachel Carson's great book, The Silent Spring, not The Silent Spring, that's something different. The Silent Spring, which galvanized a major environmental movement at the middle of the century, and won, as a result, the formation of the country's Environmental Protection Agency. That agency actually imposed taxes on the petroleum and chemical industry to fund efforts to clean up toxic waste sites on U.S. territory. In other words, it pioneered an approach known as polluter pays, which was, to this day, far more progressive than current carbon trading schemes, which substitute the carrot for the stick and work through markets, incentivizing polluters through the carrot. Yet, sorry, I hear my phone ringing. I hope that someone will pick. Let me just hold on a second. Hi, sorry, I can't speak to you right now, but I'll call you back. Thank you. I apologize for that interruption. Where was I? Yeah, so the polluter pays idea is much more progressive than the various markets in emissions permissions and offsets. On the other hand, I don't mean to idealize this regime. State capitalist regulation of nature was also built on disavowed cost shifting. The regime systematically unloaded eco-externalities disproportionately onto poor communities, especially communities of color, both in the core, and we see the legacy in places like Flint, Michigan, or the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. And it also was funded by ramped up extractivism and environmental road displacement on the periphery. That's that question again up there. In any case, the state-managed regime gave way in the 1970s to the present regime, or what developed as the present regime of financialized capitalism. That regime has relocated much manufacturing to the global south, while leaving the global north to specialize in the so-called post-material triad of IT, services, and finance. Google, Amazon, Goldman Sachs. But once again, the appearance of liberation from nature is misleading. Northern post-materialism rests upon southern materialism, mining, agriculture, manufacturing, as well as on fracking and offshore drilling in its own back north. Equally important, consumption in the global north is ever more carbon intensive, with steep rises in air travel, meat-eating, cement paving, and overall material throughput. Under these conditions, however, the grammar of eco-politics is shifted. As global warming has displaced chemical pollution as the central issue, so markets and emission permits have supplanted coercive state power as the go-to regulatory mechanism. And the international has replaced the national as the favorite arena of global governance, of eco-governance. Environmental activism has altered accordingly. The wilderness protection current has weakened and split, with one branch gravitating to the green capitalist power center, the other to increasingly assertive movements for environmental justice. The latter now encompasses a broad range of subaltern actors, from southern environmentalisms of the poor, resisting enclosures and land grabs, to northern anti-racists targeting disparities in exposure to toxins, and to indigenous movements fighting pipelines, eco-feminists battling deforestation, and many of these movements overlap one another and link to one another in transnational networks. At the same time, state-focused projects, which had until recently been sidelined, are now re-emerging with new vigor. As populist revolts, both left and right, have shattered belief in the magical properties of free markets, some are returning to the view that national state power can serve as a major vehicle of eco-societal reform. So we have on one side eco-populist nationalists like Marine Le Pen with her new ecology, and on the other side, Green New Dealers on the other. So two labor movements, long committed to defending the occupational health and safety of their members, but wary of curbs on development, are now looking to green infrastructure projects to create jobs. Finally, at the other end of the spectrum, degrowth currents are finding new recruits among youth attracted by their bold civilization critique of spiraling material throughput and consumer lifestyles, and by the promise of buen vivir through veganism, commoning, and a social or solidarity economy. Now, brief and stylized as they may be, these historical reflections offer support for my two propositions. First, that capitalism harbors a deep-seated ecological contradiction that inclines it non-accidentally to ecological crisis. And second, that those dynamics are inextricably entwined with other non-environmental crisis tendencies and cannot be resolved in isolation from them. Ecological questions, I think it now becomes clearer, cannot be separated from questions of political power, racial oppression, imperial domination, and indigenous dispossession, genocide, nor from questions of livelihood, community, and social reproduction. So it's not surprising that struggles over nature have long been deeply entangled with struggles over labor, care, and political power in every phase of capitalist development. Single-issue environmentalism, by contrast, is historically exceptional and periodically problematic. It flies in the face of the reality that the environment cannot be adequately protected without disturbing the institutional framework and structural dynamics of capitalist societies. So we have to ask ourselves today, will our chances to save the planet be squandered by our failure to build an eco-politics that is trans-environmental and anti-capitalist? What is needed, I'm suggesting, is a clear and convincing perspective that connects all of our present woes, ecological and otherwise, to one and the same social system, and through that to one another. Now, I've been insisting here that that system has a name. Capitalist society conceived expansively to include all the necessary background conditions for a capitalist economy: non-human nature and public power, expropriable populations, and social reproduction, all non-accidentally subject to cannibalization by capital, all now under the wrecking ball and reeling from it. To name that system and conceive it broadly is to supply a piece of the puzzle we need to solve. This piece can help us to align the others, to disclose the likely tensions and political synergies of all the various forms of eco-politics, to clarify where they have come from and where they might go together. Anti-capitalism is the piece that gives political direction and critical force to trans-environmentalism. If the latter opens eco-politics to the larger world, the former trains its focus on the main enemy. Anti-capitalism is what draws the line necessary to every historical block between us and them. Unmasking carbon trading as the scam that it is, it pushes every potentially emancipatory current of eco-politics to publicly disaffiliated from green capitalism. It pushes each current, too, to pay heed and try to overcome its own Achilles heel, its inclination to avoid confronting capital, whether by pursuing illusory delinking, as in the case of degrowth, or by pursuing what can only be a lopsided class compromise, as in the case of the Green New Deal, or by pursuing what must end as a tragic parody in extreme vulnerability, in the case of environmental justice. By insisting on their common enemy, moreover, the anti-capitalism piece of the puzzle indicates a path that partisans of degrowth, environmental justice, and a Green New Deal can travel together. It remains to be seen whether any destination along that path will actually be reached, or whether the Earth will continue to heat to the boiling point. But our best hope for avoiding the latter fate is to build a counter-hegemonic bloc that is trans-environmental and anti-capitalist. Where exactly such a bloc would take us, where it to succeed, remains a bit obscure. But if I had to give the goal of a name, I'd opt for eco-socialism. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, Nancy, that was just amazing. In a very short time, you've mentioned to touch upon many issues.
I'm not hearing you.
Maybe if I stand here, can you hear me better? Yeah? So I just stand here. So thank you very much, Nancy. You've been able to touch upon many issues and very clearly explained how the environmental crisis is so much intertwined with so many social issues, from gender reproduction to political power to race, and how the solution out of this is to create this counter-hegemonic movement which is trans-environmental and very anti-capitalist. So thanks for that. So let's pass to a round of questions and answers. So we have also two panelists in the room, which will also help to answer any questions, or maybe you can take place again. Okay, so I can imagine that Nancy's speech, but also the panel we had before sparked many questions. So yeah, who wants to start? Yeah. And for who is your question?
Maybe for Niels.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, so this is mainly a question for the previous panelist, Niels, but also Nancy and the others can also add to it. So we talked, Niels, you gave an example about people at Tata Steel losing their jobs if, well, the transition goes wrong, so to say. So this has to do with the just transition and the energy transition, let's call it that. But there's also this third transition, which is the digitization. So I'm talking about robotics, automation, people's jobs being replaced by modern technology. So can you comment on how these, three transitions, and then it becomes, of course, more complicated, but do you have any idea how these would intertwine, or maybe two of them? Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
Thanks for the question. Nancy, I think you missed our introduction, so I'll just briefly say who I am. Niels van Helius, I'm a member of the Dutch Trade Union Federation.
Can you just wait 1 second? Nancy, are you able to hear what's being said in the room?
Yes, but it's not very clear. Maybe you could hold the microphone closer or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's,
trying
I hear, but it's difficult.
Okay.
For example, I couldn't hear what the first transition was in the question. I heard the second and the third, but not the first.
I could quickly summarize. So we have
Tell me what the first one was. I don't know.
let's call it green transition or energy transition and social one. And then the third one would be digital. That's how it works in my mind, but maybe Niels can comment on.
Yes.
Actually, Nancy, the other panelist, Niels, will first comment, and then Niels, the other panelist we have in the room, will first comment on this question, and then we will give you room to answer.
So I think in the transitions addressing the various crises that we're facing, I mentioned that I think from a trade union perspective there needs to be a lot of public investment into other forms of work, such as care work, care work is in the healthcare and education, which is low carbon work. So if some of the production is shifted to automation, and that these proceeds of that labor saving goes to the people working in the industry, so they own the means of production, or we as society own that, we can then shift that free time to have these people do other work, which is necessary. And I mentioned, for instance, the things on the oil rigs. If we don't have workers on the oil rigs, they can do other meaningful work, such as these firefighting things. So I don't think that a lack of work is per se problematic. I think it comes down to who owns the economy, and I think as a union we want to see more public sector work, so that's democratically owned by society, so that we can all decide who works less, what work needs to be done, and I think the question about the digitalization of the economy is too complex to take up here, so I'll just leave it at that.
Nancy, do you also want to comment on this?
Yes, I think I very much agree with what Niels just said. From what I said in my talk, I think you can already see that for me, green energy transition and just transition are deeply entwined. That's both for conceptual reasons, because of the way that the problems are inextricably entwined, but it's also for good political reasons, because we don't have enough political force to affect a major social transformation if we focus on only people who identify themselves first and foremost as environmentalists. We need to bring in people who may have other concerns that seem to them more existentially urgent, but are linked up. So those two, and I just want to say a word about the digital. Before I get to that, one more point, just echoing Niels. I completely agree that there is plenty of work to be done. We don't have a problem of too little work. What we have a problem is that the work is currently oriented to producing commodities instead of use values. Commodities that give profit to some corporations or their investors and shareholders. And it's their bottom lines that dictate what is produced and how, not only on what energetic basis, but through what kinds of social relations and so on. And in the meantime, there's a vast quantity of unmet basic human needs across the globe, which cannot be produced in the current system because they're not profitable to produce. So if we actually wanted to begin to produce use values that satisfy human needs, we would have plenty of work to do. But that would require that we socialize investment decisions. Investment decisions are now made according to profit criteria or share price criteria, what drives up the share price. They are not made according to what's needed. So we would need somehow to have the question of need satisfaction and use value production be the governing criteria for deciding how we invest our time and our capacities. And I just want to say on digitalization, I'm very skeptical, not because the technology is inherently problematic, although I have to say that currently its production is quite problematic. It depends on the mining of rare earths, minerals, of lithium, of coltan, and so on, much of which is being mined by enslaved children in the Congo now. So we have a big problem, both in terms of the materiality of it and the social relations of it. But apart from that, the technology is not problematic, but its current social organization is problematic. And here I just want to recommend Shoshana Zuboff's great book, Surveillance Capitalism, which will explain to you the political economy of data mining, which is you get all your wonderful social media because you are the source of the new extractivism. Your search histories and so on and so forth are the stuff, and it's all targeted back at you in ways that, feedback loop that makes you behave in certain ways that, upon greater reflection, you might not choose to behave in. So I'm very skeptical about the digitalization unless it were liberated from this whole system of capitalism.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for your sharp answers. Are there more questions?
How do we keep Extinction Rebellion from becoming environmentalism of the rich?
Can you just repeat here?
So how do we keep Extinction Rebellion from becoming... how do we keep XR, yes, from either becoming or being or amplifying or, I don't know, environmentalism of the rich?
Or is it already?
Okay, the question here was how can we make sure that Extinction Rebellion does not engage in environmentalism of the rich? Nancy, can you answer, or maybe Kate?
You guys have to answer that. You have to answer that one. I don't know enough about PR, but I love the name anyway.
Kate, do you have opinions on that?
I mean, I think we do have opinions. I think we've shared some of them in the preceding panel. And I would say that a lot of the conversations that we had in the first part of the evening about the importance of building alliances, the importance of recognizing that environmental struggle is linked to other forms of struggle, and putting that into kind of concrete terms by building solidarity with other movements, I think all echoes, non-coincidentally, a lot of the ideas that Nancy has presented here for us today. I wonder if I can take advantage of holding the microphone to also turn this around for an additional question for Nancy. As I say, I think a lot of us here are kind of deeply in agreement with this idea that what we need is a trans-environmental and a anti-capitalist politics, and a new counter-hegemony based around that. So and I think you've done an amazing job in this short presentation of setting out what are some of the core principles behind that, and some of the core kind of analytic frameworks that can support that. But I wonder if you have any thoughts that you would like to share on the kind of the strategy and the tactics of it, of how we go about building that kind of counter-hegemonic bloc as a bloc for collective action.
Okay, Nancy, I believe you had a hard time understanding the question.
Yeah, I heard the middle, but I missed the beginning and the end. Could someone give me a two-sentence summary, maybe?
Yeah, can you maybe just stand here and then repeat it? Yeah, maybe we're super better here.
The microphone is making a lot of noises. Sorry for that, yeah, we're having some troubles with the sound, but I said to begin with that I think a lot of what we've said in the room so far has really echoed this idea that what we need is a politics that is trans-environmental, that is anti-capitalist. And I think your talk did an amazing job of laying out a lot of the analytical foundations for that, a lot of the concepts that are needed to kind of found that, and the historical understanding. But I wondered if you have ideas that you want to share about what the kind of concrete strategies or tactics might be for moving towards building that kind of bloc in joint action.
Thanks for the question. Some of you might know that I'm one of three co-authors of a little book called Feminism for the 99%, a Manifesto. And that was an intervention within the feminist movement, arguing, it's kind of parallel argument against single-issue feminism, against liberal feminism, against the feminism of the 1%, of the Hillary Clintons and Sheryl Sandbergs and Christine Lagardes and so on, and in trying to show how gender issues, or what we call gender issues, are inextricably entwined with all sorts of other concerns that we think of as not women's issues, but that are the deep concerns of the vast majority of women and for that matter, of men. So I always said at the time, wouldn't it be great if other social movements tried to sort of, take on this kind of strategy? Who will write environmentalism for the 99% manifesto? Who will write the Black liberation for the 99% manifesto, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, so that's one issue, is that each movement has to somehow open itself up, change its understanding of what its portfolio is. Then there are a whole, set of more practical questions about connecting. I mean, one thing I would say, many of us who come out of the history of the 1960s, 70s, and later, and on to your generation, I think many of us came of age understanding how the classical Marxist insistence that labor struggles at the point of production were the one true, struggle that really got at the core of the problem, how the working class defined as wage workers in factories, not caregivers and all sorts of other people. How those workers were the so-called designated agent of emancipation. We grew up profoundly convinced that that was completely wrong and that there had to be some way of not claiming to be the primary contradiction, the primary agent of emancipation. Because that's a bad picture of what capitalism is. And I guess what I would be saying to you, that the ecological contradiction is deeply existential and threatens to obliterate us all, and it's deeply urgent. But it's not the only contradiction of capitalism. And I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, but I think that to claim that everyone needs to drop everything else and do this only, risks putting you in the same position as that old Marxist idea. So that might be, the idea of a coalition in which different people are in it for different reasons and have different priorities, but respect one another and are tied together by the fact that there's one social system that undergirds all of this and that everyone for different reasons wants to transform. That's the best way.
Wow, well, that's very good. Thank you very much. I think I saw a finger there before. That was you, no?
Yeah, if it's my Nancy, you can
Hi, I have a question for Nancy. I just had a week of climate activism and I'm super tired, so I hope I can properly formulate it. You express how the environmentalist problem is very much linked and intertwined with our social system and with the social issues. And I'm wondering whether all these connections can make it, for me it means how much we are in a certain system. The environmental problems, the social problems, the political problems, the democratic problems. And I'm wondering whether you see that as a chance that all these causes are interlinked, or rather that would make it even more complicated to overcome the problems that we are in.
Yeah, look, it's certainly a more challenging picture to understand capitalism as a sort of entwined complex of multiple contradictions that generates lots of bad troubles in a variety of arenas, and that periodically, what I didn't talk about is that periodically the crisis tendencies actually converge in a single hot mess. Not just a sectoral crisis, like an economic crisis or a crisis of care, whatever. No, a general crisis of the whole social order. And those things don't come along very often. They're quite rare in history. I didn't go into this, but the various phases of capitalism's history that I referred to, the mechanics of transition from one phase to another goes through this kind of general crisis. When the system becomes so dysfunctional in such a general way for so many people and across so many spheres of life, that a critical mass begins to defect and withdraw their support from the established political classes and rulers and parties and begins to look for alternatives. Now, no one can know for sure until afterwards. But my hunch is that we are in one of these rare periods of general crisis right now. And I think that is why you see all these defections from the various center-left parties that have ruled us, or center-right parties, or grand coalitions of center-left and center-right. We have, that's why so many people are defecting on one hand to some of these really awful forms of right-wing authoritarian populisms, and even some of them might merit the name of proto-fascist forms on the one side, and to the various left populisms or attempts to reinvigorate the social democracy on the other side. The Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party in the United States, the now, I guess, flailing defeated Corbyn wing of the Labour Party in the UK. And yeah, we could talk about so in other words, there's a lot of defection, of searching, of experimentation, of volatility with people voting for Sanders in one election, Trump in the next election, and right, this kind of stuff, looking for something that works, and often ending up in bad places. I think that that's our situation. And I think that it's a situation in which the center does not and cannot hold, in which something has to give. And so the scenarios that could emerge include some very, very bad ones. And I would say that our only choice is to jump into this vacuum and try to offer some radical and transformative and appealing vision of another way to live, another way to organize society, that can compete with the Trumps and the Orbans and the Erdogans and the Modis and so on and so forth. I think to move to the center and hide behind the skirts of the liberals is a disaster. That is not going to work. And that, so I think it's a time to think very big. That's just my analysis of the context that we're in. And in this context, we have two different ideas of revolution. One is this sort of utopian idea that we're going to finally get to the good society that will overcome all forms of oppression and depredation. Fine. I doubt very much that any transformation, however positive, is actually going to deliver on that. But there's another idea of revolution, which comes from a famous phrase of Walter Benjamin in his thesis of the philosophy of history. And he says maybe we should think of revolution not as the final dawning of history after a long slog through prehistory, but rather as pulling the emergency brake on the runaway train that we're on and that is hurtling into the abyss. That's a much more sober idea of what a transformation means. But to me, it rings true. Whether it's appealing enough to woo masses of people, I don't know. But I think that's a fair estimate of what our situation is. If we do nothing else, let's at least pull the emergency brake.
Wow, thank you very much, Nancy. That was a great, great reflection. Niels and Katie, do you want to add on that? The question was how, if climate change is so intertwined with so many topics, is that actually an advantage, or can it also be more difficult to solve?
Yeah, but what I meant by this answer, and I grant you it wasn't maybe, it didn't seem to be on point, but what I meant was actually that that all of the whole thing is unraveling in all of its dimensions, and none of them can be sewed up by itself and or solved by itself. I say the same thing to people who think the fascists are at the door and we have to do nothing but protect democracy. What does that mean if this democracy is burning up the planet and throwing billions of people into sickness and starvation? Right? So, we have to somehow address all of this. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nancy. I think your question was, or your answer was clear enough. I just repeated the question also for the other panelists. But no, I think you made a great analysis. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I fear I won't be as eloquent as Nancy put it. And I will also take this space, and I said this earlier, I think we're in a space of comradely discussion, and I think it's important to also challenge each other in things that could go better. And Katie, as my colleague knows, I'm really an optimist most of the time. But I think the challenges that are facing us and the weakness of the left here in the Netherlands, in Europe, globally, is really cause for concern. And in this, we see a lot of defections indeed, unfortunately, veering off to the right and far right. And that is dangerous. And people who are on the fence, people who have something to lose in society as it is, who are afraid that these big problems, these crises, environmental crises, other crises, will cause them something, will hurt their life. I think we as a left here in the Netherlands and globally, we have not enough to offer to them in terms of come join us for a better world, to convince them to join with us. And those who motivate that political center to the right on the basis of fear, because they have something to lose, they have their car to lose, they have their job to lose, they have their privilege to lose. And the right and the far right does offer answers to them. And I think, luckily, we see a lot of young people. We see a lot of young people who really come out and say the challenges for the climate crisis are something I'm deeply involved with, and I want to take up that challenge and fight for it. But our numbers are definitely not enough to shift the balance of power, and also our narratives are not inviting enough for many people who have not this as their primary concern in life to join us. So in that, I think those who have a radical perspective and are willing to go the extra mile really need to take into account that we need to convince broad masses of people. And our last climate march here, just before the national elections on 40 locations, brought people in the tens of thousands to the street, which is good. But we lost the elections. So we need to be mindful of this is not, I'm not saying this to say we don't have power, we don't have imagination, but the challenges are real. And for that, I think we need to seriously strike alliances with not just people on the left and who are of a more radical orientation, but the fact that the trade union movement is now on board with these climate protests, it's meaningful. And we need to invest as radical people to convince those people who are on the fence, who have something to lose, that we have a better solution than those on the right and the far right. And that will require some very serious work on our side. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. I think that's the challenge we have. Well, time has been running, and I realize we've kept Nancy and the two of you way longer than we promised. So yeah, if there's maybe somebody has a very urgent, short, punctual question. No? Then, well, I guess we should leave it here. So Nancy, well, thanks so much. It was great. Thank
you. I really enjoyed being with you even in this very distance way, and I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. It means the world that you gave well, your time to us, and we've learned so much and we've been inspired. Thanks so much. Also by you, Niels and Katie, thanks so much. Yeah, it was a delight to hear your opinions and your analysis and perspectives. And to wish you also lots of luck with the projects you're in, with well, the labor union, with the Transnational Institute. You're doing great work, and I hope as Extinction Rebellion we can keep collaborating. So yeah, also a great applause for our two panelists. My soul unfortunately had to leave early. But yeah, well then also thanks for the great audience. Yeah, thanks for being here today. Okay, let's call it a night. Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks.